On a warm summer evening, July 17, 1996, the day was beginning to fade into twilight along the New York coastline. At John F. Kennedy International Airport, one of the busiest hubs in the United States, countless flights were taking off and landing, connecting people across the world. Among them was Trans World Airlines Flight 800, a regularly scheduled service from New York to Paris, with a stopover in Rome. For the 230 people on board, it was a journey filled with expectation, routine, and anticipation. Some were heading home, others were traveling for work, and many were beginning long-awaited vacations. There was laughter in the terminal, embraces at the gates, hurried boarding calls, and the usual atmosphere of a summer evening departure. Few could imagine that this ordinary flight would soon become one of the most infamous disasters in aviation history. The aircraft assigned to this journey was a Boeing 747-100, a wide-bodied jumbo jet, the pride of commercial aviation in its era. Known for its size and reliability, the 747 was often called the Queen of the Skies. It had carried millions of passengers safely across oceans since its introduction in the early 1970s. For TWA, Flight 800 was part of a prestigious transatlantic route, one that symbolized connection between the United States and Europe. The aircraft that day had been in service for over 2 decades, yet was considered dependable, well-maintained, and ready for another long journey over the Atlantic. Crews had prepared the jet, fueled it, and loaded it with luggage and cargo as ground operations proceeded normally. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Passengers filed onto the aircraft, guided by the flight attendants, finding their seats across the multiple cabins. Families with children settled in for what would be a long night flight. Business travelers opened briefcases or checked their schedules, and couples whispered to each other about Paris, their awaited destination. The crew, led by Captain Stephen Snyder, a highly experienced pilot, prepared for departure with the confidence of professionals who had performed these routines countless times. The co-pilot and flight engineer carried out checks with precision, ensuring all systems were ready. For the passengers, the routine announcements played, seatbelts were fastened, and safety instructions were delivered. Engines roared to life as dusk spread across the horizon. The aircraft, weighing hundreds of tons, taxied smoothly across the runways of JFK, heading for takeoff. 8:18 p.m. Air traffic controllers cleared TWA Flight 800 for departure. The engines thundered as the Boeing 747 accelerated along the runway, lifting gracefully into the summer sky. The massive jet climbed over the New York coastline, banking eastward over the Atlantic Ocean. Inside, passengers likely felt the familiar sensation of ascent, ears popping, seatbacks vibrating, the hum of engines steadying into their cruising rhythm. Cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane rose above the coastline, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of 230 souls. For many, it was just another flight, routine and uneventful. For others, it was the beginning of a journey that held personal meaning. For all, it would tragically be their final moments in the sky. Air traffic controllers tracked the flight on their radar screens as it climbed to 13,700 feet. Just minutes after takeoff, everything appeared normal. Pilots exchanged brief routine communications with controllers, reporting their position and altitude. In the cockpit, the crew likely anticipated leveling off soon and preparing for the long crossing toward Europe. It was a clear evening, visibility good, and the skies calm. No warning lights flashed, no unusual alarms sounded, no sign that something catastrophic was about to unfold. Then, without warning, at approximately 8:31 p.m., just 12 minutes after takeoff, a bright flash was seen in the sky off the coast of Long Island. Within seconds, an explosion ripped through the center of the Boeing 747. A fireball erupted, visible for miles along the shoreline. Witnesses on the beaches and boats below described seeing the plane suddenly burst apart, illuminating the night sky with a devastating brilliance. In an instant, Flight 800 disintegrated in midair. The fuselage broke into pieces, trailing flaming debris as it fell toward the ocean. What moments earlier had been a majestic silhouette climbing into the sky was now a scattering of wreckage descending into the dark waters of the Atlantic. On board, there was no time to react. For the passengers seated in the cabin, the explosion was immediate and overwhelming. The aircraft structure gave way under immense force, causing a catastrophic breakup. Parts of the plane spiraled downward, engulfed in flames. The cockpit separated from the fuselage. Engines tore free from the wings. Luggage, seats, and fragments of the plane rained into the sea. The violence of the event meant there was no chance of survival. Within moments, all 230 lives were lost. Down below, shock spread quickly. Fishermen, boaters, and residents along Long Island witnessed the horrifying spectacle. Many initially thought they were seeing fireworks, as it was a summer evening near Independence Day celebrations. But soon, the scale of the fireball made clear that something far more serious had happened. Calls poured in to emergency services, people reporting a plane exploding in midair, debris falling from the sky, flames lighting up the horizon. Rescue teams and Coast Guard vessels were immediately dispatched to the crash site, their mission desperate to find survivors, if any remained. As boats reached the area, they encountered burning wreckage floating on the surface, luggage scattered across the waves, and oil slicks igniting into flames. Divers entered the waters, searching desperately, but the destruction was absolute. Within hours, it became clear that no one had survived the explosion. Bodies were recovered alongside fragments of the aircraft. The ocean floor became the graveyard for one of the most devastating aviation disasters in American history. News of the explosion traveled quickly. In New York, emergency lines were overwhelmed as families of passengers tried to find out what had happened. The media began broadcasting live updates, with reporters rushing to Long Island to cover the unfolding tragedy. Initial reports were chaotic and conflicting. Some said a bomb had gone off, others claimed a missile had struck the aircraft. What was certain was that TWA Flight 800 had fallen from the sky in an extraordinary fireball, and all lives had been lost. The nation was stunned, and the world was watching. For investigators, the disaster posed an immediate and urgent challenge. What had caused a modern, sophisticated Boeing 747 to explode without warning only minutes after takeoff? Aircraft of this type were among the safest and most trusted in the world, and the violent mid-air breakup suggested something extraordinary. Was this a terrorist attack, a missile strike, or a catastrophic mechanical failure? In the first hours after the tragedy, no one knew for certain. As night fell and recovery operations continued, the waters off Long Island became crowded with Coast Guard vessels, helicopters, and search teams. Families began gathering in New York, desperate for answers, clinging to the hope of survivors, even as evidence pointed to total loss. TWA officials tried to manage the crisis, providing updates but unable to give the clarity that grieving relatives craved. The disaster had left not only an immense loss of life, but also a mystery that demanded urgent answers. The destruction of Flight 800 was unlike anything ordinary in aviation accidents. Most crashes leave a trail of evidence on land or concentrated in one area. Here, wreckage was spread across miles of ocean, shattered into thousands of pieces. The task of recovering, analyzing, and understanding what had happened would require one of the most complex investigations in aviation history. But in those first hours, the only reality was grief, confusion, and the terrible image of a plane bursting apart in the sky. The night sky over Long Island carried a silence before the thunder of tragedy. When the explosion tore through Flight 800, it was not only the passengers who felt its force. On the ground and at sea, hundreds of eyes witnessed the moment, forever burned into their memories. Fishermen saw what looked like a glowing streak before a ball of fire lit up the horizon. Families on the beach turned their heads to the sound of a blast. Pilots flying nearby noticed an unusual flash from above. Within seconds, what had been an ordinary summer evening became one of the most chaotic and haunting scenes ever observed in American aviation. Emergency radio chatter erupted immediately. Calls to Coast Guard stations, police, and fire departments described a plane disintegrating in midair. Some callers were convinced they had seen a missile rise into the sky. Others believed it was a bomb. an act of terror that had struck an international flight. The uncertainty was overwhelming. All that was clear was that 230 people were gone in an instant, and wreckage now floated in the Atlantic waters like scattered remnants of a nightmare. Rescue operations launched swiftly. Coast Guard cutters, helicopters, and small boats rushed toward the crash zone, guided by the burning debris on the water. Their crews hoped against hope that someone might be found alive, clinging to wreckage. But as they moved closer, the reality set in. Bodies, seats, and twisted fragments of metal were scattered across the waves. The violence of the breakup had given no passenger any chance of survival. Divers entered the black water, illuminated only by floodlights and the flickering flames of burning fuel. They recovered what they could: remains of those who had perished, pieces of luggage, and fragments of the aircraft that might one day help tell the story of what had gone wrong. Onshore, families of the passengers waited in agony. News of an incident involving a TWA flight had already spread, but details were slow and uncertain. Airline representatives tried to manage the flood of questions, but grief overwhelmed the waiting halls. Loved ones clutched photographs, asked for names, begged for confirmation. The silence of official reports told them what they feared most: there would be no survivors. Television screens across America soon filled with breaking news banners. Reporters described an explosion in the sky, debris falling into the ocean, and a devastating loss of life. Live coverage showed boats circling the crash site, searchlights combing the water, and plumes of smoke rising from the waves. Experts speculated on possible causes. In 1996, the memory of terrorist attacks was strong, and suspicions ran high. Only months earlier, a truck bomb had devastated the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, and just a year before, the Oklahoma City bombing had shaken the United States. To many, the idea of a missile or bomb destroying a passenger plane seemed not just possible but likely. Witness testimonies fueled this belief. More than 100 people described seeing a streak of light rising into the sky just before the explosion. To the untrained eye, it looked like a missile arcing upward, striking the aircraft. Theories spread like wildfire, magnified by the media's relentless coverage. Was this a terrorist act against the United States? Could it have been an accidental military strike? Had a bomb been smuggled aboard the flight? The questions multiplied, each one casting a deeper shadow over the tragedy. Back at the crash site, the enormity of the task ahead became evident. The Atlantic waters off Long Island were now both a grave and a crime scene. Recovery ships worked through the night and into the days ahead, pulling wreckage from the sea. Thousands of pieces were collected, catalogued, and transported to a hangar where investigators would attempt the unthinkable: rebuilding the Boeing 747 piece by piece. It was the only way to understand what had happened. In the earliest hours, though, there was no time for detailed analysis. The priority was to bring closure to families by recovering the remains of their loved ones. Divers continued their grim task, returning daily with what the ocean had taken. Each recovery carried unbearable weight, each piece of wreckage a silent witness to the final moments of Flight 800. For the rescuers, the emotional toll was immense. Many later recalled the haunting images of that night. The endless fragments of lives interrupted, the eerie silence of the sea broken only by the hum of recovery equipment. As days turned into weeks, the investigation began to take shape. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the National Transportation Safety Board worked side by side. To the FBI, the possibility of terrorism loomed too large to ignore. Agents scoured passenger lists, background checks were conducted, and intelligence agencies searched for any sign of a plot. Meanwhile, the NTSB focused on the mechanical aspects, analyzing wreckage, examining flight data, and listening to the cockpit voice recorder. The flight recorders themselves offered little drama. The cockpit voice recording ended abruptly, with no sign of distress from the crew, no warning of trouble, no alarm in their voices. One moment the crew was flying normally, and the next the recording was cut short by the sudden loss of the aircraft. the lack of any communication reinforced the violent and instantaneous nature of the disaster. Meanwhile, the eyewitness accounts could not be ignored. The image of a streak of light rising toward the sky became a central feature of the unfolding narrative. Theories of a missile strike dominated public discussion. Some pointed to U.S. Navy exercises being conducted in the Atlantic that same evening. Could the military have accidentally fired on a civilian aircraft? Others believed a terrorist group had launched a shoulder-fired missile. The evidence, however, remained elusive. No missile fragments were found among the wreckage. No chemical traces of explosives appeared in the initial tests. Still, the suspicion lingered, fueled by the sheer horror of what had occurred. For the families, these debates brought little comfort. They gathered in hotels and conference rooms, waiting for news from officials, forming bonds with one another in shared grief. The loss was overwhelming. Children, parents, spouses, and friends were gone. Every name represented a story cut short. Among the passengers were 16 high school students and 5 chaperones from Pennsylvania, traveling to Paris for a cultural exchange program. Their sudden deaths devastated an entire community back home. Businessmen, artists, and tourists filled the rest of the passenger list, each one with loved ones left behind to mourn. The tragedy touched lives across continents. In the following weeks, funerals were held, memorials built, and vigils lit the night skies in remembrance of those lost. Yet the central mystery remained unsolved. What could cause a modern jumbo jet, flying in clear weather only minutes after takeoff, to explode so suddenly and violently? The sheer scale of the investigation, the thousands of pieces of wreckage, and the complexity of separating fact from speculation meant that answers would not come quickly. But one thing was already certain. The sudden explosion of TWA Flight 800 was not just a loss of life, it was an event that shook confidence in aviation itself. Travelers questioned the safety of flying, airlines faced renewed scrutiny, and the government faced pressure to explain how such a disaster could happen just miles from the American shoreline. The first keynote of this tragedy, the departure and sudden explosion, remains the defining moment, the instant where everything changed. The departure was ordinary, filled with the rituals of air travel, the routines of boarding and takeoff. The explosion was extraordinary, an event so violent and swift that it defied imagination. Together, they formed the haunting opening chapter of a disaster that would become one of the most studied, debated, and remembered in aviation history. As the investigation moved forward, it would dive into deeper layers of mystery, examining every possibility from mechanical failure to sabotage, from electrical sparks to missiles. Yet no matter how many theories arose, the haunting memory of that summer night, of a plane climbing into the sky and then disintegrating before the eyes of hundreds, remained at the core. It was the moment when 230 lives ended, when the Queen of the Skies was torn apart, and when the world was left to ask the question that would echo for years: what really happened to TWA Flight 800? When TWA Flight 800 vanished from radar and burst apart in the night sky, the chain of response began almost instantly. At 8:31 p.m., the controllers monitoring the flight at New York Air Traffic Control saw the signal disappear without warning. One moment, the Boeing 747 was climbing smoothly at 13,700 feet. The next, its transponder was gone. For those in the control tower, it was as though the aircraft had been erased from the sky. Confusion filled the room. Controllers attempted to reach the crew by radio, calling for TWA 800, asking for confirmation of position, but no response came back. Silence answered every call. The operators glanced at each other, knowing that silence in such moments rarely meant anything good. Down on the Long Island shoreline and out at sea, hundreds of witnesses had seen the night explode into fire. Calls poured into local emergency numbers. People on boats reported debris raining from the sky, others described the deafening roar of an explosion, while beachgoers told police that an aircraft had just broken apart. Within minutes, dispatchers realized something catastrophic had occurred. The Coast Guard scrambled vessels from nearby stations, while helicopters lifted off into the night. their searchlights scanning the dark surface of the Atlantic. Local fire departments and police departments activated their emergency protocols, converging on the shoreline. The first responders who arrived at sea were met with a scene of overwhelming devastation. Instead of survivors clinging to wreckage, what they found were burning pieces of the aircraft floating in patches of fire on the ocean's surface. Flames licked at the waves where jet fuel spread in a shimmering trail. Seats, luggage, and broken fragments of the plane bobbed in the water, carried by the current. The air was heavy with the smell of burning fuel and scorched metal. Search teams shone spotlights across the waves, hoping to find life, but the vast silence of the ocean told its own story. Despite the overwhelming violence of the explosion, the rescuers refused to surrender hope. Divers prepared to enter the water, paramedics readied equipment, and boats scanned the surface for movement. They expected perhaps a miracle, someone who had managed to survive against all odds, holding onto a piece of debris. But as the hours passed, it became painfully clear that no one had lived through the breakup. The explosion had been too sudden, too violent, and too complete. The rescuers, who had rushed to the scene with determination, found themselves instead retrieving bodies and wreckage. At 8:45 p.m., just 14 minutes after the disaster, word reached hospitals in Long Island that a major aviation accident had occurred. Emergency rooms braced for an influx of survivors. Ambulances were prepared, trauma teams assembled, and blood supplies readied. But as time ticked on, no patients arrived. Nurses stood waiting in hallways, doctors by operating tables, yet no stretchers came through the doors. The realization was devastating. The scale of the explosion had left no one alive to be treated. Back at sea, recovery operations intensified. Coast Guard cutters formed search grids, systematically sweeping the waters to collect what they could. Helicopters hovered overhead, their rotors chopping through the humid summer night, shining beams of light across the black Atlantic. Smaller boats joined the effort, piloted by locals who had seen the disaster and wanted to help. Together, they combed the area, gathering fragments of the plane and recovering victims. Every item pulled from the water was handled with solemn care, each one a piece of the larger puzzle that would later be assembled in hangars and labs to tell the story of what had happened. Meanwhile, confusion rippled through New York and beyond. Families who had gathered at the airport to wave goodbye to loved ones or waited for information at ticket counters were left in agonizing uncertainty. Airline officials tried to provide updates, but the truth was grim. Gradually, the news filtered through that the plane had been lost and there were no survivors. Grief overtook waiting rooms. People collapsed in tears, hugged each other in disbelief, or stared blankly at the television screens already broadcasting the first shaky footage from Long Island. In homes across America and around the world, the tragedy broke through television programs with urgent announcements. News anchors spoke of a plane exploding off New York, showing grainy images of fires on the ocean surface and flashing lights of rescue vessels. For viewers, the scale was difficult to comprehend. A wide-body Boeing 747, one of the largest and most trusted jets in the skies, had simply disappeared in a fireball. The initial questions flooded every broadcast. What had caused this? Could it be terrorism? Was it a mechanical failure? The images of burning wreckage left no doubt about the magnitude of the disaster. As hours passed into the early morning, recovery teams grew larger. Hundreds of rescuers participated in the search, some combing the surface, others preparing to dive into the depths below. The ocean floor beneath the wreckage site became the focus of a painstaking effort. Thousands of pieces of metal, from tiny fragments to large fuselage sections, had scattered across miles of seabed. Every piece needed to be recovered if investigators were to learn the truth. For divers, it was a grim and exhausting mission. They descended into cold, dark water, surrounded by twisted metal and the haunting silence of what had once been a bustling aircraft cabin. Each dive brought back evidence, some technical, some personal, pieces of the plane, but also items belonging to the passengers' shoes, books, jewelry, watches, each one a reminder of the lives lost in an instant. Onshore, the aftermath unfolded in different ways. Hotels near JFK Airport were converted into makeshift waiting areas for the families. Airline representatives, counselors, and government officials tried to manage the raw grief of relatives who demanded answers. Parents, spouses, children, and friends crowded into rooms, watching television coverage, listening for updates. Many refused to believe what they were hearing, clinging to the faintest hope that perhaps someone had survived, that somehow their loved one might walk through the door. But as night turned to day, hope turned to heartbreak. Officials eventually confirmed that there were no survivors. The news struck like a second explosion, this time in the hearts of the families gathered in disbelief. The recovery operation at sea became one of the largest in U.S. history. Navy ships were brought in, equipped with sonar and heavy lift cranes to locate and retrieve larger sections of the aircraft. The wreckage field stretched across more than a dozen miles of ocean, forcing divers to map out the area systematically. Every dive was documented, every piece marked, bagged, and tagged. Slowly, the ocean began to surrender its secrets, though not without immense effort. The debris was transported to a facility where investigators would later attempt the painstaking process of reconstruction. At the same time, the FBI joined the recovery effort, treating the site as a possible crime scene. The presence of law enforcement officers alongside divers and Coast Guard crews emphasized the uncertainty of what had caused the explosion. If a bomb or missile had destroyed the plane, then evidence could be hidden among the wreckage. Investigators collected samples from the water, tested for explosive residue, and carefully examined passenger belongings. Each discovery raised more questions than it answered. For the first responders themselves, the emotional toll was heavy. Many later spoke of the haunting silence they encountered at the crash site, broken only by the sound of waves and the creak of wreckage shifting in the water. They recalled the sight of luggage floating like ghostly reminders of the lives that had ended so suddenly. Some rescuers, hardened by years of service, admitted that the scale of this disaster shook them to their core. It was not just a crash, it was an explosion that left nothing whole, nothing intact, and no chance for survival. As the recovery continued, the nation's focus turned to Long Island. News crews from across the world set up along the shoreline, broadcasting live around the clock. Families arriving to visit the site looked out at the endless ocean, knowing that somewhere beneath lay the remains of the plane and their loved ones. Memorials sprang up in local towns, flowers and candles left by strangers who felt the weight of the loss. The collective grief of the country merged with the frustration of uncertainty. How could this happen? What force could tear apart one of the most advanced aircraft in the world, just minutes after leaving the safety of New York's airports? The immediate aftermath of the disaster became a story of contrasts, the tireless efforts of rescuers working against impossible odds, the endless questions posed by investigators, and the unbearable grief of families who had lost everything in the blink of an eye. The rescue had quickly turned into recovery, and the recovery into investigation. Yet in those early days, the overriding feeling was one of shock. No one could yet explain how or why TWA Flight 800 had been destroyed. As the night gave way to dawn, the reality of the disaster unfolded in sharper focus. The waters off Long Island were littered with floating debris, and the once frantic hope for survivors had long faded into the certainty of total loss. Coast Guard cutters crisscrossed the debris field, their crews silently working to haul in wreckage. Every item was a clue, every discovery a fragment of the truth. Divers surfaced with bundles of twisted metal, shattered pieces of the fuselage, and items that had belonged to passengers who, just hours before, had been alive, laughing, and boarding a plane bound for Paris. The weight of the tragedy pressed heavily on the first responders. Many of them, hardened by years of service, later admitted that the horror of Flight 800 was unlike anything they had ever encountered. To retrieve not survivors but remains, To see the ocean filled with the everyday belongings of people who had simply set out on a journey, it was overwhelming. They carried out their tasks with quiet determination, but the grief etched itself deeply into their memories. Some rescuers would never forget the sight of children's shoes floating in the water, or the eerie stillness that hung over the crash zone after the last flames had been extinguished. Onshore, a different kind of battle unfolded. The families who had gathered at hotels near JFK were forced to face the unbearable truth. Airline representatives, government officials, and grief counselors attempted to provide comfort, but there are no words that can soften the blow of such a loss. Parents wept uncontrollably, spouses clung to each other in despair, children asked questions no one could answer. Some families screamed in anger at officials, demanding explanations that did not exist yet. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process the reality that their loved ones were gone forever. News networks broadcast the pain in real time. Images of sobbing relatives leaving conference rooms, of candles being lit at vigils, of wreckage being lifted from the sea played across millions of television screens. America and the world bore witness not only to the loss but also to the raw, immediate grief of those left behind. The names and faces of the passengers began to circulate. Photographs of young students on a cultural exchange trip, of business executives, of families heading to vacations, of newlyweds embarking on a honeymoon. The scale of the human loss grew larger with each story that emerged. At sea, the recovery operation expanded dramatically. The U.S. Navy deployed some of its most advanced ships and equipment. Sonar systems scanned the ocean floor, marking the positions of large debris sections. Divers worked in shifts, descending into the cold, dark water to recover wreckage and remains. Submersible vehicles, equipped with robotic arms, joined the search, capable of reaching depths too dangerous for human divers. The logistics were immense. Thousands of fragments scattered over miles of seabed, requiring careful cataloging and retrieval. Every day brought new challenges, from unpredictable currents to the sheer enormity of the task. Despite the scale of the effort, there was an unspoken urgency that drove everyone involved. The nation wanted answers, the families demanded clarity, and investigators needed evidence. Every recovered piece of wreckage was carefully tagged and transported to a temporary collection site. Eventually, much of it would be moved to a massive hangar in Calverton, New York, where the painstaking process of reconstruction would take place. The sight of wreckage filling trucks, each carrying part of the story of Flight 800, became a haunting routine for those working the shoreline. The FBI maintained a strong presence, treating the area as a possible crime scene. Agents interviewed eyewitnesses who had reported streaks of light in the sky. They collected samples from the wreckage, tested for chemical traces, and coordinated with intelligence agencies to rule out terrorist involvement. At the same time, the National Transportation Safety Board focused on the technical aspects, determined to understand the mechanical and structural events that could have caused such a sudden explosion. The dual investigation created a tense atmosphere where theories of bombs and missiles clashed with the quieter, methodical work of engineers and aviation experts. For the media, the tragedy was a relentless story. News anchors speculated on air, filling gaps in knowledge with conjecture. Theories of a missile strike dominated early coverage, driven by eyewitness accounts and the geopolitical tensions of the time. Newspapers carried bold headlines suggesting sabotage, terrorism, or even military error. Families, caught in the crossfire of speculation, were torn between anger, suspicion, and despair. For many, the uncertainty was worse than the loss itself. Grieving was nearly impossible when the question of why remained so brutally unanswered. In the communities connected to the victims, the immediate aftermath rippled like shockwaves. In Montoursville, Pennsylvania, the high school devastated by the loss of 16 students and 5 teachers became the focus of national mourning. Vigils filled gymnasiums, classmates wept openly, and the small town struggled to comprehend how so many young lives could vanish in an instant. Across the Atlantic, Families in France and Italy grieved their own losses, their sorrow tied to a tragedy that had crossed borders and oceans. The impact of Flight 800 was not confined to one place. It became a shared wound felt around the world. Meanwhile, the search at sea became increasingly methodical. Day after day, Navy divers worked under grueling conditions, piecing together the scattered remains of the jumbo jet. Large cranes lifted massive sections of fuselage from the water, dripping and bent, bearing the scars of an unimaginable explosion. Investigators stood on deck as each piece was brought aboard, trying to imagine how it fit into the puzzle of the aircraft. Slowly, over weeks and months, the recovery mission transformed from chaos into order. Piles of debris began to take shape, sorted and arranged, ready for the forensic work to come. But the emotional weight never lifted. For every piece of wreckage recovered, there was also the reminder that 230 lives had ended in those same waters. Memorial services continued across the country, with candles burning for the dead, prayers offered for peace, and unanswered questions whispered by grieving relatives. The ocean had given up fragments of metal and belongings, but it could not offer the closure that families sought. That would come only with time, with the grueling process of investigation, and perhaps with the eventual truth of what had destroyed Flight 800. As days turned into weeks, the immediate aftermath settled into a painful rhythm. Families met with investigators, asking questions that still had no answers. Officials promised transparency, but offered little detail in the early stages. Journalists continued to press for information, often fueling public suspicion with speculation. For the rescuers, the recovery shifted from the desperate search for survivors to the meticulous process of gathering evidence. Yet the memory of those first chaotic hours, of fire on the water, of silence in the skies, of grief breaking out in waiting rooms, remained the defining image of the immediate aftermath of TWA Flight 800. It was in those moments, when the nation was still reeling from shock, that the tone of the entire investigation was set. The rescue had failed because there was no one left to save, and the recovery was immense because the ocean held the key to the truth. The immediate aftermath revealed the fragility of life in the skies, the limits of even the most advanced machines, and the resilience of those who, despite heartbreak, continued to search for answers. The story of the aftermath is not only one of loss and confusion, but also of the determination to confront tragedy head-on. From the divers who risked their lives in treacherous waters, to the families who demanded truth despite unbearable pain, to the investigators who sifted through every fragment of wreckage. The response to Flight 800 showed the human instinct to seek understanding, even when faced with the incomprehensible. And yet, for all the effort, the lingering mystery of that first night would cast its shadow for years to come, as the search for answers moved forward into one of the most complex investigations in aviation history. As the investigation into TWA Flight 800 began to take shape, one factor immediately stood out: the voices of the eyewitnesses. Hundreds of people along the Long Island coast, fishermen, beachgoers, pilots in nearby aircraft, and residents who had stepped outside on that calm summer night, all reported seeing something unusual in the sky. Their accounts varied in detail, but many shared one striking similarity. Before the explosion, they had seen a streak of light, like a flare or a missile, rising toward the plane. These descriptions could not easily be dismissed. More than 700 eyewitnesses came forward in the weeks following the disaster. Some said they saw a trail of light moving upward from the horizon. Others insisted they had seen an object hit the aircraft just before the fireball erupted. The sheer number of people reporting similar images sparked immediate speculation that Flight 800 had been struck by something external, something violent, perhaps even a missile. In the charged atmosphere of the mid-1990s, the possibility of terrorism loomed heavily in the public consciousness. Just a year earlier, the Oklahoma City bombing had shocked the nation. Just a few years before that, the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, had shown the world how vulnerable commercial aviation could be to acts of sabotage. When eyewitnesses spoke of streaks of light and fiery trails, the idea of an attack seemed to fit too easily into the fears of the time. For the FBI, these accounts demanded urgent attention. Teams of agents were dispatched to interview witnesses in meticulous detail. Each statement was logged, cross-referenced, and mapped against radar data. The hope was that by assembling the testimony, a clearer picture of the final seconds of Flight 800 could emerge. But what surfaced was a chaotic mosaic. Some witnesses described a light rising from the water, others described a flash in the sky, while some claimed to have seen two distinct explosions. The differences in perspective, distance, and memory complicated the story, but the consistency of certain details could not be ignored. News media seized upon these reports almost immediately. Headlines across the nation blared with speculation. Missile brings down TWA Flight 800. Television anchors introduced experts who debated whether it was possible for a terrorist with a shoulder-fired missile to strike a commercial airliner. Talk of naval exercises off the Long Island coast further fueled suspicion. Was it possible, some asked, that the U.S. military had accidentally fired a missile that struck the aircraft? Conspiracy theories found fertile ground in the uncertainty. On the beaches of Long Island, ordinary people struggled with their own haunting memories. Some swore they had seen a streak of light moving from the ocean upward to the sky. Others recalled the night's eerie silence before the explosion. In interviews, they described flashes of orange and yellow, a trail of smoke, and then a sudden burst as if something had detonated in midair. To them, it seemed impossible that such images could be anything other than a missile. Pilots flying in the area that night also gave statements. A captain on a nearby aircraft reported seeing a bright flash just ahead of him, followed by a fireball. While he did not specifically claim to see a missile, the description added weight to the possibility of something external. Radar operators reviewed their screens for anomalies, but the complexity of the data and the speed of the event left many questions unanswered. The idea of a missile attack resonated with the public partly because it was dramatic, terrifying, and fit into a broader narrative of vulnerability. A missile strike was a story people could understand, a direct act of aggression that explained the unexplainable. But behind the scenes, investigators knew that following such a path was fraught with difficulty. Evidence would have to be conclusive, because to declare that a passenger jet had been shot down, by terrorists or by accident, would have global consequences. Still, the early stages of the investigation gave the missile theory momentum. FBI agents searched for explosive residue on the wreckage. Military officials were pressed to disclose whether any training exercises had taken place nearby that night. The Coast Guard and Navy reported that no missiles had been fired in the region, but skeptics remained unconvinced. For those who believed what their eyes had seen, denials were not enough. Families of the victims, desperate for answers, listened closely to every theory. Some clung to the idea of a missile because it provided a villain, a human cause, something tangible to blame rather than the idea of mechanical failure or random chance. Others feared that the truth was being hidden, that officials would prefer to cover up a military mistake rather than admit responsibility. In community halls and private meetings, the debates mirrored those in the wider media, where speculation swirled like smoke. Television networks aired graphics showing how a missile might have risen from the ocean to strike the aircraft. Animations illustrated the path of a shoulder-launched weapon, with experts debating whether such a weapon could reach a jetliner at cruising altitude. Military analysts explained that while possible, it was unlikely, given the plane's distance from shore and the sophistication required. Yet the doubt persisted, fed by the collective testimony of eyewitnesses who had no reason to lie. Forensic investigators faced immense pressure. If the plane had been struck by a missile, there would be physical evidence. Shrapnel patterns, explosive residues, burn marks consistent with a warhead detonation. As the wreckage was laid out piece by piece in Calverton, experts scrutinized every section for signs of external penetration. But in those early months, with so much debris still missing and public expectation running high, definitive answers remained out of reach. The eyewitness accounts became both a guide and a burden. They represented the raw observations of ordinary people, unfiltered and emotional, but they also added noise and confusion to an already complex case. Psychologists would later note how the human eye, especially when observing distant events at night, can misinterpret streaks of light, blending timelines and sequences. What some described as a missile's trajectory might have been the aircraft itself breaking apart, a sequence of explosions mistaken for a single rising light. But in the immediate aftermath, such interpretations did not diminish the weight of hundreds of similar testimonies. Rumors of a Navy exercise near the crash site added fuel to the fire. Though the military insisted no live fire training had taken place in the area, conspiracy theorists suggested that a missile had been launched accidentally, striking Flight 800 in error. The theory gained traction in books, documentaries, and television specials, becoming one of the defining controversies of the case. For many Americans, the eyewitness accounts were too numerous, too consistent to be ignored. In the court of public opinion, the missile theory took on a life of its own. Families demanded answers, journalists pressed officials, and talk radio hosts turned it into a rallying point for suspicion of government secrecy. For the FBI, every new witness account added to the mountain of interviews, charts, and cross-examinations. Agents tried to map trajectories, timelines, and positions, but the evidence remained circumstantial. What the public saw as certainty, investigators viewed as fragmented memory. The tension between eyewitness testimony and forensic science would soon become one of the defining struggles of the investigation. Eyewitnesses carried the emotional weight of lived experience, the conviction of those who had seen something with their own eyes. Forensic experts, however, demanded physical proof, measurable data, and consistency across findings. The two sides seemed to collide, leaving the nation suspended between competing narratives of tragedy. By the end of the first year after the crash, the missile theory had become the dominant public narrative, overshadowing other possibilities. Documentaries aired on primetime television, books were published, and talk shows hosted fiery debates. To many, the eyewitness accounts represented undeniable truth, a window into the final seconds of Flight 800. But within the investigation, the question lingered: were these accounts reliable guides to the truth, or haunting misperceptions born in the chaos of disaster? And so the stage was set for one of the most contentious chapters in aviation history, where science, memory, politics, and grief would clash over the skies of Long Island. The voices of the witnesses, amplified by media and suspicion, became central to the enduring mystery of TWA Flight 800, raising questions that would not be easily silenced. As the months after the crash passed, the eyewitness accounts refused to fade into the background. For many who had watched the tragedy unfold, their memories became even sharper with time, replayed endlessly in their minds, sometimes haunting their dreams. People who lived along the coast of Long Island remembered standing outside on a calm summer night, enjoying the quiet air, when suddenly a streak of light split the darkness. To them it was unmistakable, a projectile rising, cutting upward from the horizon, and then, moments later, a fireball where Flight 800 had once been. The images were etched so deeply into their memories that no explanation could erase what they believed they saw. Investigators, however, faced the enormous task of reconciling these testimonies with the physical evidence. At the Calverton hangar, the reconstruction of the aircraft was well underway. Piece by piece, the jetliner was being reassembled like a giant, twisted puzzle. Engineers and aviation specialists scoured every surface for signs of external penetration or explosive residue. Yet, despite the intensity of the search, what they found seemed to suggest something different from the eyewitness accounts. There were no clear indications of a missile strike, no puncture wounds characteristic of shrapnel, no residue consistent with a warhead. The wreckage told a quieter story, one of an internal explosion rather than an external impact. But while the science leaned one way, the voices of the public leaned another. Witnesses continued to testify to grand juries, to speak in interviews, and to describe what they had seen to anyone who would listen. The image of a missile streak became almost mythic, repeated so often in the press and in conversations that it began to feel like a shared memory rather than a collection of individual ones. And with each retelling, the suspicion of government secrecy grew. If so many people claimed to see a missile, why were officials so adamant in denying it? Why did every official statement insist that there was no evidence of an attack, while hundreds of accounts said otherwise? The U.S. Navy, repeatedly questioned, maintained its stance that no live fire exercises had taken place in the region on the night of July 17, 1996. Still, speculation persisted. Books and television programs accused the military of a cover-up, suggesting that a missile had been fired accidentally during a training exercise and had struck the aircraft by mistake. According to these theories, officials had quickly moved to conceal the truth to avoid international embarrassment and legal repercussions. The very absence of evidence became, in the eyes of conspiracy theorists, proof of a cover-up. Families of the victims were left torn between conflicting narratives. Some clung to the missile theory because it felt more bearable than the idea of a random mechanical failure. If their loved ones had been killed by human error or deliberate malice, there was at least someone to hold accountable, someone to blame. Others, however, found the speculation cruel, feeling that it prolonged their grief by drawing out uncertainty. In hotel conference rooms and memorial gatherings, families debated among themselves, some accusing the government of lies, others urging patience and faith in the investigative process. As the media fanned the flames, the missile theory gained a momentum of its own. Television news produced dramatic graphics of shoulder-launched missiles arching into the sky, their fiery tails eerily similar to what witnesses had described. Experts debated whether such a weapon could reach the altitude at which Flight 800 was flying. While some analysts dismissed the possibility, others admitted that a well-trained operator with the right equipment might have been capable of such an attack. The idea of a terrorist hiding on the shoreline with a portable launcher seemed chillingly plausible, especially in an era where threats against aviation were becoming increasingly real. But there were inconsistencies. A shoulder-fired missile has a limited range, and Flight 800 was already climbing through 13,000 feet when it exploded, beyond the capability of most man-portable systems. A ship-launched missile would require a vessel close to shore, but radar and surveillance showed no such launch. The U.S. Navy's own records indicated no weapons had been fired, no exercises underway, and no stray missile that could explain the disaster. Still, suspicion clung tightly to the story, as if the lack of evidence itself suggested a deeper truth being hidden from public view. The eyewitness accounts, though powerful, were also fragmented by perspective and memory. Some had been watching from miles away, others from closer vantage points. At night, distances are deceiving, lights can blur, and sequences of explosions can appear as single events. Psychologists explained how memory under stress can reshape itself, filling gaps with assumptions, turning one flash into a streak, or confusing the direction of motion. But these explanations did little to ease the conviction of those who believed their eyes had not deceived them. To them, what they had seen was clear, and no scientific theory could erase that image. The controversy deepened when radar data was reviewed. Some analysts claimed that radar had picked up fast, moving objects near the flight path, possibly consistent with a missile. Others insisted these were artifacts of the system, ghost signals with no real meaning. Once again, interpretations split along lines of suspicion. Those who believed in the missile theory saw confirmation, while investigators seeking mechanical causes dismissed it as coincidence. The debate spilled into courtrooms, television specials, and books. Independent investigators and retired military officers weighed in, some insisting the missile theory was credible, others ridiculing it as conspiracy thinking. For the families and the public, The cacophony of voices created a fog thicker than the one that had hidden the ocean floor where the wreckage had lain. In that fog, truth seemed elusive, distant, and perhaps permanently out of reach. For those who believed a missile had struck Flight 800, the cover-up theory explained everything: the denials, the lack of evidence, the official insistence on mechanical failure. In their minds, the government had too much to lose by admitting responsibility, whether it was a terrorist act they had failed to prevent or, more damningly, a U.S. military mistake. The idea of a powerful institution hiding the truth fit into broader public mistrust of authority, especially in an era shaped by scandals and secrecy. The official investigators, however, pressed forward. Forensic analysis of the wreckage, chemical testing, and simulations all pointed increasingly toward an internal fuel tank explosion caused by a combination of factors that made the aircraft vulnerable at that precise moment. But outside the walls of the investigation, the missile theory continued to thrive, nourished by the eyewitnesses who, even years later, stood by their memories of streaks of light and fiery trails in the sky. The enduring power of those accounts lay in their humanity. People believed what they had seen, and to dismiss them felt like dismissing their very experiences. Yet memory is fallible, and in the case of Flight 800, the conflict between memory and material evidence became the central tension of the tragedy. One side offered heartfelt conviction, the other painstaking science. Together, they produced one of the most divisive investigations in aviation history. By the time the investigation moved into its later stages, the missile theory had become less of an inquiry and more of a cultural narrative. It was no longer just about the events of July 17, 1996. It was about trust in institutions, about whether ordinary people's voices could stand against official accounts, and about the fear that tragedies might be buried beneath layers of secrecy. The eyewitness accounts ensured that the missile theory would never fully disappear, no matter what conclusions the investigators reached. And so, in the long shadow of Flight 800, the voices of those who stood on the shore that night continued to echo. Their words carried doubt, fear, and conviction, ensuring that the theory of a missile would remain woven into the story of the disaster forever. It was not just about what happened in the sky above Long Island. It was about how people remembered it, how they interpreted it, and how those interpretations shaped the enduring mystery of TWA Flight 800. In the months following the tragedy of TWA Flight 800, a monumental task unfolded inside a massive hangar in Calverton, New York. Here, amid the echo of footsteps and the cold light of industrial lamps, investigators began the painstaking process of reconstructing the aircraft. What had fallen in pieces into the Atlantic Ocean was to be reassembled, one fragment at a time, into the ghostly outline of a jumbo jet that no longer existed. It was not merely an act of science. It was an act of respect, a commitment to the truth, and a way to give voice to the silent wreckage that held the answers. The work was overwhelming in its scale. The ocean had scattered the jetliner into thousands of fragments, from twisted sheets of aluminum to fragments of wiring and shattered seats. Each piece had to be retrieved, cleaned, cataloged, and carefully arranged according to its place in the original aircraft. Engineers and forensic experts worked like archaeologists at a dig site, laying out sections of fuselage along scaffolding, reconstructing the shape of the plane from memory, blueprints, and careful study. Over time, what emerged was the skeletal remains of Flight 800, a grim monument that stood as both evidence and memorial. The reconstruction was not just a technical exercise. It was a pursuit of truth. Investigators searched each fragment for signs of fire, stress, or explosive residue. Every piece told part of the story. Some bore scorch marks, some bent outward, some crumpled inward, each pattern suggesting the direction of force. Experts examined wiring harnesses, fuel pumps, and the delicate systems that powered the aircraft. They paid particular attention to the center wing fuel tank, an area that appeared to be at the heart of the disaster. The fragments surrounding this section bore the hallmarks of intense pressure and fire, suggesting that the first catastrophic failure had originated there. But science moved slowly, and the world outside was impatient. Families wanted answers, the media demanded explanations, and conspiracy theories swirled like storm clouds. Yet inside the hangar, progress was steady. Investigators simulated conditions, running tests to determine how fuel vapors might ignite under certain temperatures. They studied the electrical systems that ran near the fuel tank, looking for evidence of a spark. The more they examined, the more the focus narrowed to a chilling possibility that a wiring fault, combined with overheated fuel vapors, had triggered the explosion that tore the plane apart. The reconstruction itself was an eerie sight. Visitors who entered the hangar described it as walking into the skeleton of a giant, its metal bones reaching out in every direction. The nose section of the plane stood reconstructed, windows broken, metal torn, but still carrying the recognizable shape of a once proud jet. The cabin walls rose in jagged lines, with missing sections revealing where the ocean had swallowed fragments forever. Standing beneath it, one could not escape the weight of what had happened. This was no longer just an aircraft, it was a silent witness, carrying the imprint of the tragedy in every scar. For the investigators, it was also a puzzle of physics. They traced the sequence of destruction, analyzing how the plane had broken apart in midair. They studied how the explosion had ripped through the fuselage, separating the nose from the rest of the aircraft, and how the pieces had fallen into the sea in patterns that told the story of disintegration. Through complex calculations and models, they reconstructed the timeline of events: first a spark, then ignition, then catastrophic rupture. The precision of science met the violence of disaster, and the wreckage spoke in ways only experts could interpret. As months turned into years, the reconstruction grew more complete, filling the hangar with an ever clearer image of the destroyed jet. Journalists were occasionally shown the progress, and families were invited to witness the work. Many were overcome with emotion, standing before the twisted remains that had carried their loved ones. For some, the sight brought a strange comfort, knowing that every effort was being made to uncover the truth. For others, it reopened wounds, the physical reality of the wreckage too painful to face. Yet all agreed that the work was necessary, that only through science and patience could justice for the victims be found. The investigation pushed the boundaries of forensic aviation science. It was among the most complex reconstructions ever attempted, involving thousands of experts, millions of dollars, and years of analysis. Out of the wreckage came not only answers about Flight 800, but also broader lessons about aviation safety. The findings would eventually lead to changes in how aircraft fuel tanks were designed, cooled, and monitored, ensuring that the same deadly sequence would not be repeated. But the reconstruction was also haunted by doubt. Eyewitness accounts and missile theories continued to dominate public conversation, creating a rift between science and belief. For investigators, the hangar at Calverton was filled with evidence pointing to mechanical failure. For many outside, it was a symbol of secrecy, a place where the truth might be hidden behind technical jargon and official statements. Yet the wreckage itself did not lie. Its bent frames, charred wiring, and ruptured tanks told a story that no theory could fully erase. In the end, the forensic reconstruction of Flight 800 was both a triumph of science and a testament to tragedy. It showed the world the lengths to which investigators would go to seek the truth, reassembling an aircraft from the depths of the sea to answer the questions of how and why. It also reminded everyone that behind every fragment of metal was a human life lost, a family grieving, and a community forever changed. The hangar in Calverton became not just a laboratory but a memorial, a place where steel and sorrow intertwined, and where the mystery of the skies was slowly unraveled through the patient work of human hands. From the very first hours after the explosion of TWA Flight 800, the government's response became a defining part of the story. The sheer scale of the disaster demanded immediate action, and multiple agencies moved in simultaneously. The FBI treated the site as a potential crime scene, while the National Transportation Safety Board focused on aviation safety and forensic reconstruction. The Navy and Coast Guard provided ships, sonar, and divers for recovery, but as the days stretched into weeks, what was meant to be a coordinated effort soon revealed cracks, tensions, and suspicions that would linger for years. The FBI's involvement reflected the fears of the era. Terrorism loomed large in public consciousness, and the eyewitness reports of streaks of light seemed to confirm the possibility of a missile or bomb. Agents worked tirelessly, collecting samples from wreckage, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, and testing every scrap of evidence for traces of explosives. For a time, the case was treated as though it were an act of war. But as the tests continued to come back negative, the FBI's certainty weakened. No bomb fragments were found, no chemical residues identified, and no direct evidence of a missile strike. Still, the agency refused to rule out foul play for months, keeping the families and the public suspended in an agonizing limbo. The NTSB, on the other hand, was never fully convinced by the missile theories. Their investigators believed the answer lay within the airplane itself, in its systems, its structure, and its vulnerabilities. For them, the painstaking reconstruction in Calverton and the endless technical simulations were the path to the truth. But this difference in focus created visible tension. While the FBI was conducting interviews and chasing leads about terrorism, NTSB engineers were focused on wiring diagrams, fuel tanks, and electrical systems. At times, their efforts clashed, with agents restricting access to evidence and slowing the work of aviation experts. Families watching from the sidelines began to lose faith that the government was truly united in its pursuit of answers. The media seized on these tensions, amplifying every disagreement between agencies. Headlines accused officials of confusion, secrecy, and even deliberate cover-ups. Television programs speculated about hidden military operations, while books accused the government of suppressing evidence of a missile strike. The perception grew that the investigation was less about finding truth and more about protecting institutions. This perception was only fueled by the slow, cautious way in which officials released information, always careful, always technical, and rarely satisfying to a public desperate for clarity. For the families of victims, the government's response was often a source of deep frustration. Meetings with officials were filled with technical language and vague assurances, while their own questions about eyewitness accounts and possible foul play were met with deflections. Some relatives came to believe they were being deliberately kept in the dark, while others saw the slow progress as proof of incompetence. Vigils and memorials became not only spaces for grief, but also platforms for anger, where loved ones demanded answers that never seemed to come quickly enough. Inside Congress, questions grew louder. Lawmakers pressured agencies for updates, and hearings probed whether the investigation was being mishandled. The possibility of military involvement was raised, and officials found themselves repeatedly denying allegations of a Navy missile strike. The more they denied, the more some members of the public grew suspicious. To skeptics, it seemed unthinkable that hundreds of eyewitnesses could be wrong. To investigators, it seemed unthinkable that so many would disregard the physical evidence. Between these two realities, mistrust deepened. As the months turned into years, the investigation dragged on longer than almost any in aviation history. Each new report promised progress, but delivered little that was definitive. Families grew wary of waiting, the public grew cynical, and the government agencies involved became lightning rods for anger. When the NTSB finally leaned toward the conclusion that a center fuel tank explosion had caused the disaster, many saw it as anticlimactic, an unsatisfying technical explanation that ignored the voices of eyewitnesses and the suspicions that had taken root. The controversy never truly went away. Even after the official report declared that mechanical failure was the most likely cause, conspiracy theories continued to circulate. Some accused the FBI of abandoning the missile investigation too soon. Others claimed the NTSB had been pressured to avoid implicating the military. The government's cautious, fragmented, An often secretive handling of the disaster had created an environment where suspicion thrived. And once suspicion takes root, it is nearly impossible to erase. In the end, the government's response to Flight 800 became as much a part of the story as the explosion itself. It revealed the difficulties of coordinating massive investigations under public scrutiny, the fragility of trust between citizens and institutions, and the heavy burden placed on officials who must balance transparency with caution. For many, the controversies overshadowed the conclusions, leaving an enduring sense that the truth had been lost somewhere between science, secrecy, and suspicion. And so, long after the wreckage had been pieced together in Calverton, the debate about what brought down Flight 800 remained a question not only of evidence, but also of faith in those who were tasked with finding it. The tragedy of TWA Flight 800 did not just end with the explosion, the recovery, or even the controversial investigation. Its lasting impact rippled far beyond the waters off Long Island and permanently reshaped aviation safety and policy. Every disaster in aviation history becomes a lesson, and this catastrophe became a turning point in how regulators, airlines, and manufacturers looked at hidden vulnerabilities within aircraft. What investigators uncovered was not an act of terrorism or an intentional attack, but a vulnerability in the very design and operation of large jets, a vulnerability that had gone unnoticed for decades and had the potential to bring down any aircraft under the wrong set of circumstances. The official conclusion of the National Transportation Safety Board identified the explosion of the center wing fuel tank as the initiating event. The tank contained only vapors and residual fuel, but the heat from the air conditioning packs beneath it, combined with aging electrical wiring, created conditions for a spark. That spark, though tiny and invisible, was enough to ignite the vapor and trigger a catastrophic explosion. For regulators, this was a sobering revelation. If a plane as sophisticated as a Boeing 747 could be destroyed by something so simple and preventable, then the industry had to re-examine not just fuel tank design, but also the electrical systems that ran throughout modern jets. In the years that followed, the Federal Aviation Administration launched sweeping reforms. New rules were introduced that required airlines to improve the wiring systems inside aircraft, inspect aging electrical components more regularly, and install systems that reduce the risk of fuel vapor ignition. Technologies such as inerting systems, which replaced flammable fuel vapors with non-flammable gases like nitrogen, began to move from experimental concepts to real-world aviation safety measures. The goal was clear: never again allow a combination of heat vapors and electrical sparks to destroy a passenger jet in midair. For the airline industry, this meant significant costs and logistical challenges. Aircraft had to undergo additional inspections, wiring bundles needed to be rerouted or replaced, and fleets had to be modified to comply with new safety directives. Airlines resisted some of the more expensive upgrades at first, but the pressure from regulators and the memory of 230 lost lives left little room for argument. The disaster had made clear that complacency could no longer be tolerated when it came to hidden dangers. Beyond technical changes, the tragedy also reshaped the way investigations influenced public policy. Flight 800 showed that the public demanded more transparency, more communication, and quicker safety responses. Regulators, often criticized for being too slow or too aligned with airlines, realized that their credibility depended on swift and visible action. As a result, the FAA and other bodies became more proactive in issuing airworthiness directives and pushing for technological improvements before accidents occurred. The philosophy of aviation safety shifted from reactive to preventive. Internationally, the lessons of Flight 800 echoed across the globe. Aviation authorities in Europe and Asia studied the findings closely, implementing similar reforms in their fleets. Aircraft manufacturers, especially Boeing and Airbus, began integrating more robust fuel tank protections into new designs, ensuring that future jets would not carry the same vulnerabilities. What had once been a hidden flaw in one model became a catalyst for safety improvements across the entire aviation world. Another critical area of reform was crew and maintenance training. Airlines began emphasizing the importance of monitoring systems related to electrical power, fuel temperature, and wiring integrity. Maintenance crews were trained to look for signs of insulation breakdown, chafed wires, and potential overheating risks near fuel tanks. The culture shifted from addressing only visible or urgent issues to anticipating the kinds of hidden threats that had caused TWA 800's destruction. The policy changes also extended to how investigations themselves were conducted. The tension between the FBI and the NTSB during the Flight 800 inquiry underscored the need for clearer jurisdiction and better cooperation between agencies. In the years after, new protocols were established to ensure smoother collaboration between law enforcement and aviation safety officials, especially in cases where terrorism was initially suspected. This not only streamlined future investigations, but also helped restore some measure of public confidence in the process. For the families of victims, these changes were both a source of comfort and a reminder of loss. Many relatives believed that the deaths of their loved ones at least pushed the aviation world to confront flaws it had ignored. Safety hearings often included testimony from family members, and their persistence ensured that regulators did not let the lessons of Flight 800 fade away. The policies that emerged carried with them the weight of their grief, turning tragedy into change. Even years later, the reforms inspired by Flight 800 continue to influence aviation safety. Each new aircraft that takes to the sky carries within it protections born from the investigation. The systems that keep passengers safe today, enhanced wiring standards, fuel inerting technology, and rigorous inspection schedules, are part of the silent legacy of that disaster. Though the debate about what truly brought the plane down may never fully end, the safety improvements that followed are undeniable, and they have likely prevented other tragedies from occurring. The explosion of TWA Flight 800 was a dark moment in aviation history, but its aftermath became a powerful catalyst for progress. It reminded the world that every failure in the sky must become a lesson on the ground. Policies changed, technology evolved, and the culture of aviation safety took a significant step forward. In the end, while the loss of 230 lives could never be undone, their memory reshaped an industry and continues to protect millions of travelers around the globe each year. The story of TWA Flight 800 did not conclude with the official report or even the safety reforms that followed. Instead, its legacy became deeply entangled with mystery, speculation, and conspiracy theories that refused to die. For many people, the explanation of a fuel tank explosion caused by faulty wiring was too unsatisfying, too ordinary, to account for the spectacular way the aircraft had been destroyed. The very speed with which the jet disintegrated, the fireball seen streaking across the night sky, and the consistent testimony of eyewitnesses who reported seeing something rise into the air before the blast all fueled a suspicion that the truth had not been fully revealed. From the earliest days after the tragedy, whispers of a missile strike began to circulate. Nearly 200 witnesses described seeing a streak of light, like a flare or projectile, ascending before the moment of the explosion. These accounts captured the imagination of the press and the public, particularly during a time when fears of terrorism and military accidents were prominent in American life. Some believed that terrorists had managed to smuggle a surface-to-air missile into U.S. waters, while others pointed fingers at the possibility of a U.S. Navy exercise gone horribly wrong. The fact that the crash occurred near an area of routine military activity only deepened suspicion. As the FBI and the NTSB pursued their investigation, the secrecy surrounding certain aspects of the case added more fuel to the fire. Families felt that their questions were brushed aside, and the slow trickle of information seemed less like transparency and more like concealment. Books, documentaries, and television specials soon appeared, each offering its own theory of what really happened that night. Some insisted that the government had staged a cover-up to protect the military. Others suggested an act of terrorism had been hidden from the public to avoid panic. and still others tied the disaster into larger conspiracies about political corruption and national security. The wreckage itself became a symbol of the mystery. Reconstructed painstakingly in a hangar, the nearly complete Boeing 747 stood as both evidence and monument. For investigators, it was proof of their technical conclusion. For skeptics, it was an incomplete puzzle, something that still left unanswered questions about the sequence of destruction. Even the removal and eventual destruction of the reconstructed wreckage years later sparked renewed controversy, with critics claiming it was an attempt to erase lingering evidence that could have pointed toward a different conclusion. The tragedy also became one of the first aviation disasters to be magnified by the Internet age. Online forums in the late 1990s and early 2000s buzzed with speculation, photographs, and amateur analyses of radar data, fuel systems, and military records. The growing accessibility of information gave rise to citizen investigators who sought to prove that the official story could not possibly be correct. What emerged was not a single conspiracy theory, but a web of competing ones, each insisting that the truth had been hidden and that justice for the 230 lives lost had not been served. The lasting legacy of these theories has been a deep divide between those who trust the official findings and those who remain convinced of darker explanations. For families, this divide has been painful. Some found closure in the idea that a mechanical failure was to blame, knowing that reforms were made to protect future passengers. Others could not accept that a state of the art jetliner could be destroyed by something as simple as a short circuit, and they pursued alternative theories for decades, keeping the controversy alive in the media and public imagination. Yet beyond the speculation, the legacy of TWA Flight 800 also lies in its place as a cultural marker of vulnerability. In the mid-1990s, America was confronting new anxieties: terrorism, military secrecy, and the limits of government transparency. The disaster embodied all of these fears in one tragic event, making it not just an aviation accident, but a story about trust, doubt, and the search for truth in an age of uncertainty. The mystery has endured because it speaks to something larger than aviation. It reflects the human tendency to question authority, to seek hidden motives, and to resist explanations that feel too simple for moments of extraordinary tragedy. Over the years, documentaries and films have kept the story alive, always hinting that something more sinister may have happened that night. Books have been written by former investigators who broke ranks, claiming they had seen evidence suppressed or misinterpreted. Each time the theories resurface, they rekindle public interest and reopen old wounds for the families. The debate over Flight 800 has become less about the facts of the case and more about the tension between official authority and public skepticism. Today, nearly 3 decades later, the mystery of Flight 800 is still spoken of in hushed tones, a blend of fact and folklore. The ocean off Long Island remains the resting place of the victims, but the story of what happened in the skies above continues to drift between two worlds: the world of science, which insists on a technical cause, and the world of speculation, which clings to the belief that something larger was hidden from view. Both worlds are part of the legacy, and together they ensure that TWA Flight 800 is remembered not just as a tragic accident, but as one of aviation's most enduring enigmas. In the end, the true legacy of the disaster lies in the combination of grief, reform, and mystery. Families mourned, aviation improved, but questions never ceased. The official explanation may stand as the record, but the whispers of conspiracy still follow the memory of Flight 800 wherever it is discussed. Perhaps that is why it continues to fascinate decades later, because it is not only the story of an aircraft lost, but of trust shaken, of answers that never fully satisfied, and of a tragedy that still echoes as one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in aviation history.